Hi everyone, welcome back to Winging It. We're in week 26 and this week we're going to be making part 2 of our garden pond block that we started last week. If you didn't see that video, don't worry, I will put the full playlist in a card at the top of the screen, and I will also link part 1 of this block directly in the description below so that you can go back and find out how we made our background for our garden pond. So last week we used lots of different cutting techniques. We used some reverse applique and a little bit of fussy cutting to create the garden pond shape, and then we added rocks and lily pads using bond web, and then we also used fussy cutting techniques to extract some of the motifs from our pattern fabrics to add some little bugs and creatures. Now this week we're going to be adding all of our embroidery. We're going to be using a range of stitches to create lots of different textures. I've brought back in the embroidery threads that we used last week. I have added a couple of other colours. So I've got my lightest green here, which is Anchor 255, and I've also got my darkest green, which is Anchor 683, and although it looks black on camera, it is a very dark sort of blue-green. I may also have added my grey, and that is Anchor 235. Can't remember whether we had this last week or not. The only other resources you're going to need today are your embroidery scissors and a selection of embroidery needles. I've got mine just off camera. Now, if you're starting your block this week, you will need to go back and watch part 1, but there is a template available. This has still got some of my markings on from last week, and you can get this from our website. I'll put the address at the bottom of the screen, and I'll also put a direct link in the description below. This costs £1 to download. It's just a nominal charge to help cover the cost of making these videos and to keep this channel running. So we're going to start by embroidering on our rocks, and I'm going to do a range of different techniques with this. So first of all, I've got 2 strands of my grey thread, and I'm just going to bring my needle up on the very edge of the rock shape. So I'm actually just on the backing fabric here, and we're going to do some shallow blanket stitches around the edge of this to outline it. So I'm going to start on the very edge. That's going to be my horizontal part of the stitch, and I'm going to go across and down just inside the rock a little bit further along. Then I'm going to rock my needle forward, bringing the point of the needle up again at the very edge of the rock shape, making sure that the needle is passing over that working thread. When I pull through, that pulls into a right angle, and I have got a little blanket stitch there. So again, I'm going to move around the edge a little bit, come just inside the rock shape and rock forward so that my needle comes out right at the edge of the shape, and then pull through. Now I'm keeping these blanket stitches very shallow, and it's the vertical part of the stitch that I'm keeping shallow. So if we think about the horizontals as the parts that are following the edge of the rock, the verticals are the part of the stitch that is coming down into the rock, and I'm keeping that very small. So these blanket stitches are wider than they are deep, and that I'm hoping is going to give a little bit of a craggy feel to the edge of the rock, but it's also going to keep these pieces secure. So one of the reasons we add embroidery is to embellish and decorate, but it's also functional because this is going to save our pieces from falling off should the bond web ever perish. So I've worked all the way around that rock, and I'm now just at the point where the rock overlaps. There's a lighter coloured rock in front of it, so I'm just going to finish my blanket stitch there by hopping across the loop that I've just caught and putting in a little anchor stitch. Now in hindsight I should have started right at the edge of the grey rock, but I didn't, so I'm just going to hop across that pale grey rock. That will leave a little bit of trailing thread at the back, but that light grey rock is very small, so it's not too big a deal. I'm just going to carry on with my blanket stitch back up to my starting point. When I'm close to my starting point, I just want to think about spacing, and so I've got 2 stitch widths here between the stitch that I've just made and the very first stitch. So I'm going to take my needle down right in the middle of those and bring it up at the edge to form a stitch, and that puts my needle 1 stitch length away from my starting point. Now if I'm very careful, I can take my needle down at the very beginning of that first stitch, making sure that I'm tucking just underneath it, and then it will look like my blanket stitches don't have a beginning and an end. That first stitch looks like it's coming out of the stitch that I've just made. So that's my first rock, blanket stitched. I can secure my thread on the back, cut it off because I don't want great pieces of trailing thread, and I'm going to repeat that process on the other 2 dark grey rocks. So I'm going to put those in, and then we'll come back and do something different with the other shades. Right, so I have blanket stitched in my darkest grey rocks, and I thought we could work on these mid grey rocks now, and I want each rock to look slightly different. I'm going to use a different stitch, but I'm also going to do something different with the thread. Now here I've got 2 strands threaded into my needle, but I've got 1 strand of white and 1 strand of grey, and so this time I'm going to blend my colours so that I create a tonal effect on these rocks. And I want to use different stitches as well, so this time I'm going to use a chain stitch. I've learnt from my mistake. I'm coming up right at the point where this rock touches the darker grey rock that I've just stitched, and this time I'm coming up inside the edge of the rock, only just maybe a millimetre in from the edge, and this is because my stitches are formed just by passing through the fabric at one point. So I brought my needle through, looped my thread round, and I'm taking my needle back down at the point where the thread first came out. Then I'm going to rock my needle forward again, making sure that working thread is passing underneath the needle, and when I pull through I catch that loop and create a tiny teardrop shape. I'm going to take my needle down at the point where the thread's coming out again, rock my needle forward, bring it up inside that loop and pull through. And this is chain stitch. This means that all my stitches are joined together, and I'm going to work my way around the outside of the rock, making those chain stitches. And I really love blended thread because sometimes my stitches will look grey, sometimes they'll look white, and I think it adds a really lovely bit of tone and texture. When I've got to the end, I'm just going to hop over that last stitch and put a little anchor stitch in, and then I can finish my thread off on the back. So that is my second stitch. I'm going to sew the other mid grey rocks like that, and then we'll look at the lighter grey rocks. That's all of those in, and I wanted to do something different again with the light grey rocks. So this time I've got 2 strands of my darkest green. You could use black if you wanted to, and this time rather than going around the edge, I'm going to put some stitches in that come in from the edge. So I'm just going to do some fairly random straight stitches, coming up right at the edge of the rock and bringing my needle into the rock and back through both layers of fabric. Then I can come up again at the outside edge and bring my needle into the rock. And I'm trying to keep these a little bit uneven, so I'm deliberately putting these stitches at different angles, spacing them differently, making them different lengths, and the aim is that I'm trying to make something that looks a little bit fractured and craggy, so that I've got some quite textural rocks as well. So I'm working all the way around the outside edge of my rock in that way, and then I can put my last stitch in, finish off my thread on the back, and that's my craggy rock. And you can see we've already started to hold down that blue fabric with more stitches than the tacking stitches that we put in last week. We'll leave those in until the stitching all the way around. I'm going to now stitch my lily pads, and you can see there I've added a little sketched circle at the centre of the lily pad, just around where the opening in the leaf is, and we're going to work some blanket stitches in a circle. So I brought my needle up right at the opening of that mouth, if you like. I'm going to then take my needle back down at the edge of that sketched circle that I've drawn, rock it forward so that it comes up a little further round the leaf at the outside edge, and catch my loop in place. So now I'm going to come back down at that centre circle that I've sketched in and rock my needle forward at a slightly different angle so that my needle comes out further around the outside edge of the leaf. Catch the loop again and pull through. Now I don't want this to be a circle, I want it to be kind of angular. So every now and again, rather than coming up at the outside edge, I'm going to come up just inside that green circular shape, and that will make my horizontal parts of my stitches go at slightly different angles to look less perfectly circular. So that's going to add a little bit more realism to this. Now when I get back round to the mouth, I want to make my last stitch so that the vertical goes along that angled edge, and then I can put my anchor stitch over the top. And it's very hard to start blanket stitch on a vertical, so I just want to add in that first vertical that's missing. So I've come up back where I started and I'm going back down at that centre little loop and putting in the missing stitch. I'm going to repeat that with all of my lily pads, and then we'll come back and look at the next stage. So that's all my lily pads stitched in. I'm really pleased with the way they look, and I thought we could add some grassy sections here. We've got some quite textural grassy sections that we're going to add in. So here's my reversed pond shape. I just want to check that I'm putting the grass in the right place according to the pattern, and you can see me there with my heat erase pen. I'm just sketching in where the grass should be going and putting in some guidelines to help me stitch in the right place. You can't see it very well because of my pattern fabric, but I can see it. It just doesn't pick up very well on camera. That tells me where I'm going to stitch, and I've got 2 strands of my mid green thread here in my needle, and I'm just going to start by putting in some straight stitches where I've got those jagged cuts at the edge of the pond, and I just want to bring my thread up onto the green backing fabric and take it back down at the very point of those little jagged cuts, and that's going to hold these pieces down. So we're not creating our grass following these little cuts exactly, but this is my starting point for my grass. It gives me a little bit of a background. I'm just going to stitch one of the grassy sections on camera, and we could do the rest off camera. So now I've got a single strand of my light green here, and we want to create texture by using different weights of thread, and I want to put in some folded or bent blades of grass here, and I'm going to do that by starting with a very long chain stitch. So just like we did our chain stitches around our rocks, I've brought my needle up, looped the thread round, taken my needle back down in the same place and rocked it forward, probably about 2 centimetres forward, and I've pulled through quite firmly so that I don't have a tear shape. I've just got this very elongated stitch. Then I'm going to put an anchor stitch that is going off in a slightly different direction, just to give a sense that this grass is folded over at the tip. Then I'm going to bring my needle back up inside that chain and make a straight stitch back down to where the stitch began, just to fill it in a little bit. So again, I'm going to bring my thread up, loop my thread around, go back down where the thread came out of the fabric, and then catch that stitch in place with an elongated anchor stitch going off at a slightly different direction. And finally put my straight stitch inside that grass blade just to make it look a little bit clearer and stronger. So I've put those in now, and I want to add a little bit more texture, make it look a little bit mossy around the pond. And we're going to do that with some loopy French knots. Now these are just made in the same way as a French knot, but I'm going to miss out a step. So normally when we would make a French knot, we would hold the working thread under tension as we pass the needle back through the fabric to make sure that our knot is sitting tightly on the surface. That's the stage I'm going to miss out. I thought it would be nice to blend some colours again, so here I've got a single strand of light green and a single strand of my darkest green. So I've brought my thread through, I'm going to rest my needle on the thread and wrap twice, and then I'm going to take my needle back through the fabric, but you can see there's no tension on that thread, and what that does is allow our loops to move and misbehave, and that's exactly what we want here. So those loops will be caught down with a little anchor stitch, but they will not be tightly pulled together, and it creates this sense of moss and gives a lovely texture. So I've put several of those in, and the last stitch I'm going to put in is pistol stitches, and these are made in a very similar way to a normal French knot, but this time instead of taking my needle back down where the thread came out, I'm going to move it away to create a stalk. So you can see I've brought my thread up there, wrapped twice, and I've taken my needle down maybe 2 centimetres away from where the thread came up, got into a bit of a tangle there, and you can see there we end up with a French knot on a stick basically, and these create lovely seed heads, and I think they're just a lovely stitch. So again, I've brought my thread up, wrapped twice, and keeping that thread under tension and pulling it through a little distance away. And making sure these go at different angles. I think that's key with these grassy sections. You don't want your stitches all in a regimented line, you want them to be a little bit haphazard and overlapping. So that's our grassy section, and I'm going to repeat that with the section on the right hand side and at the top of the pond, and this is what it looks like. So I've put in some extra stitches here. I've got some little grey knots as well. I wanted to create more of a sense that there are pebbles, and I've done this with all 6 strands of grey, and I've wrapped 3 times to create bigger knots. Now I've got some blended thread here, so I've got 3 strands of my dark brown and 3 strands of my grey, and I just want to add in some more pebbles just around the rocks and in the grass, just to add a little bit more of a naturalistic feel. So these are just normal tight French knots that are made with blended thread, and I'm using 6 strands and wrapping 3 times, so these are going to be quite chunky. Every now and again I do a slightly smaller knot, so I just wrap once, and I think it creates something that looks a little bit like gravel. So I've put in some grey and some blended knots all around the pond, in the grass and around the rocks, and that has added loads of texture to the outside edge of the pond. Now I'm concerned as always about bond wear, but I do worry that as this quilt is used and washed, it could cause the bond web to fail and we'll have bits dropping off, and so I'm just going to put in some stitches on my applique fussy cut bugs here. So I'm starting with my ladybird. I've got a single strand of red thread, and I'm just adding some very tiny applique stitches around the edge. So I'm coming up just inside the shape of the ladybird, and going down just outside the edge of that ladybird shape, just through the backing fabric. I'm just holding that ladybird in place, very subtle stitches, you can barely see them. I want to do something similar on my little moth, and I am going to use the pattern on the design to guide me. So I've got my single strand of red, and I thought I would do some couching. I've just come up at the moth body. I'm taking my needle down right at the outside edge, making sure the thread is following one of the lines on the wing. Now I'm going to come up a little way back into the wing, right at that line where the thread is lying, and I'm going to take my needle over the top of the thread and back down on the other side, and that puts a little catching stitch in over the top of that thread to hold it in place. And you can see me there with my nail just manipulating that thread so that it's sitting right along the line in the design. This means that I can make curves with my thread, and I'm going to repeat that on all the lines on the wing, and that will give my moth a little bit of security. So I've added some stitches in, done the other ladybird, I've put some black stitching onto that little beetle at the bottom. Now, one of the ways that we are going to create a harmonious quilt is by echoing motifs all the way across. Now, pattern fabric is helping with that because there are certain little motifs from that fabric that are going to appear all the way across our quilt, but we can also do that with some of the stitching that we've used. And we've used lazy daisies in lots of other blocks, and I thought it would be nice to harmonise this block with others. I've got lots of blocks that have got this grassy fabric on, but also with the stitching that we're putting on. I'm going to use some of our yellow, pink and blue thread to add in some lazy daisies around the pond on the grass and echo those daisies that we've put in elsewhere. So lazy daisies are just chain stitches worked around a central point. I've used these in loads of videos, so I will link a tutorial for this in a card at the top of the screen, so that if you're not sure, you can go and check those out. And those lazy daisies have just got a little French knot at the centre just to create a middle for the flower. I've also got some white and blue threads. I've got 2 strands of white thread here, and I'm just adding some bubbles to the surface of the pond. I'm going to do exactly the same with some blue thread in a moment, just scattering some French knots over the surface of the water just to break it up and suggest movement and life in the water. So you can just be quite free with this, a little bit haphazard. Now, one of the final things I'm going to do is add some leaves to my lazy daisies, and I'm blending my thread again. So I've got a single strand of my light green and a single strand of my mid green here, and I'm going to make some leaves in the same way that we did our blades of grass, making elongated chain stitches. So I'm making a chain stitch, and then I'm using a longer anchor stitch at the end of each detached chain to make the leaf seem pointed. Then I'm going to bring my needle back up inside the leaf and put in a straight stitch to add a bit of filling. I'm going to scatter those all around where I've put in the daisies, and that just makes them appear anchored onto the grass rather than just floating on the surface. So our very last thing is our water lilies, and we're going to use woven wheels for this. So I'm going to start off by marking an odd number of points around my circle. I'm using 7 points, but you could use 5, you could use 9. It depends on how you want your little water lily to look. And I'm going to put in some spokes first of all. So I'm bringing my needle up at the outside edge of the circle, and I'm going to take it back down at that centre point. Then I'm going to work my way around to my next marker around the edge of my circle, and come back down at the centre, and then out at the next point, back down at the centre, and that creates this series of spokes. And it's really important that you have an odd number because we're going to weave in a circle, and we want our stitch pattern to switch every time we go around the circle. So once I've put in all my spokes, I'm going to bring my needle back up at the centre, and I want to go over one spoke and under the next, and then over the next spoke and under the next, and I'm going to keep going until I'm back round to where I started. And at this point you'll notice that the next, where I've gone under on the first circuit, I am now forced to go over on my second circuit around my spokes, and so that's going to create a lovely woven effect. And I just keep doing that until I run out of thread, which I have done here. And to handle that, what I want to do is take my needle back down underneath the spoke where I would have passed my thread under, and then I can secure it on the back, start a new thread, and I just want to come up where my thread went down, but on the other side of that spoke, and that's going to give the illusion that my thread is passing under the spoke rather than through the fabric. So I'm just going to carry on weaving all the way to the very edge of my spoke so that I can't see them anymore. And when I'm happy that my lily is complete, I take my thread back through the fabric and secure it at the back. So here's our finished piece. I did one of my water lilies with 2 strands of pink, and the other 2 I've made with blended white and pink thread, and that is our finished block. I'm so delighted with the way this came out, and I just think it's so happy. And if I bring it up to the camera, you'll be able to see some of the stitching a little bit better. So there's our woven wheel water lilies, that's one of the blended ones. We've got our lily pads that are quite angular around the outside. We've got our lazy daisies. We've got our little fussy cut motifs, and then we've got that gorgeous textured grass and pebbles around the outside edge. So I hope you've enjoyed that exploration of decorative embroidery. If you have, please do give this video a like. We really appreciate it, and it helps other people to find our videos as well. Do share your garden pond blocks at hashtag FSH23quilt if you post them on social media. That way we can see what everybody else has created. I hope you've enjoyed that. If you would like something similar, I will link some videos over here, and if you'd like to subscribe, it would mean the absolute world to us to have you join our little community. Just click our logo at the bottom here and it makes it really easy for you. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great week embroidering your garden pond, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!